December 16th, 1944. 5:30 a.m. German artillery opened up along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest. Over 200,000 German soldiers were about to smash through American lines in what would become the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in World War II. And Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, the man responsible for millions of Allied troops across Europe, didn't panic. He didn't immediately rush reinforcements. He didn't frantically reshuffle his command structure. For 48 hours, he watched. He listened. He waited. Some historians call it paralysis. Others call it indecision. They're both wrong. What Eisenhower did in those 48 hours was one of the most calculated gambles of the entire war. He let the crisis develop. And by doing so, he gained something no Allied commander had possessed since D-Day: complete operational control. Before we go deeper into how Eisenhower turned disaster into opportunity, hit that subscribe button. We dig into the real stories behind history's biggest moments, the decisions that changed everything, told the way they actually happened. Now, let's get back to December 1944 and understand what Eisenhower saw that everyone else missed. December 16th, 1944, 12:30 p.m. Eisenhower's headquarters, Versailles. The first reports were coming in. German attack in the Ardennes. Heavy casualties. American units being overrun. The staff at DCisive, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was in chaos. Junior officers rushed through hallways with urgent messages. Phones rang constantly. Maps were being updated minute by minute as the scope of the disaster became clear. Eisenhower sat in his office, reading the reports calmly. His intelligence chief, General Kenneth Strong, stood across from him, visibly shaken. Strong had missed this. Allied intelligence had completely failed to predict the largest German offensive since 1940. Strong expected to be fired. Instead, Eisenhower asked him a simple question: how many divisions? Strong checked his notes. Initial reports suggest 3 German armies, at least 20 divisions, possibly more. Eisenhower nodded slowly. That's a lot of strength. Where did they pull it from? Strong spread a map across Eisenhower's desk. They stripped their defensive lines across the entire Western Front. They pulled panzer divisions from reserve. They even brought in units from the Eastern Front. This is everything they have left, General. Eisenhower studied the map for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised Strong. Good. For the first time since Normandy, I know where the German army is. Strong stared at him. General, with respect, the German army is currently destroying 4 of our divisions. Eisenhower looked up from the map. Kenneth, since we broke out of Normandy, what's been our biggest problem? Strong didn't hesitate. The Germans keep retreating. We chase them, they fall back, establish new defensive lines, and we attack again. It's been 5 months of grinding advances. Eisenhower tapped the map, and now they're not retreating. They've come out of their fortifications. They're exposed. They're committed. If we respond correctly, we can destroy them. Strong saw it then. The problem the Allies had faced since August wasn't breaking through German lines. It was pinning down German forces long enough to destroy them. The Germans were masters of defensive warfare. They would hold a position, inflict casualties, then retreat before being surrounded. It was frustrating, exhausting, and it meant the war kept dragging on. But now, the Germans had committed everything to an offensive. They couldn't retreat without losing all the ground they had gained. They were exposed, vulnerable. If Eisenhower could contain the offensive and then counterattack, he could destroy the German army in the West. But there was a problem. Eisenhower didn't have operational control to do it. December 1944. The Allied command structure was a political nightmare. Eisenhower was supreme commander, but his authority was constantly challenged. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded 21st Army Group, the British and Canadian forces in the north. General Omar Bradley commanded 12th Army Group, the American forces in the center and south. Both men reported to Eisenhower, but both men also had direct lines to their political leaders. Churchill for Montgomery, Roosevelt for Bradley, and Montgomery and Bradley hated each other. It wasn't professional disagreement. It was personal animosity that threatened Allied unity. Montgomery believed he should command all Allied ground forces. He thought American generals were amateurs. He had been pushing for months to get Bradley removed or demoted. Bradley believed Montgomery was a glory hound who moved too slowly and took credit for American victories. He had threatened to resign if forced to serve under Montgomery. Eisenhower spent half his time managing this rivalry. Every operational decision became a political battle. Montgomery wanted all resources funneled to his sector for a single thrust into Germany. Bradley wanted a broad front advance. Churchill backed Montgomery. The American Joint Chiefs backed Bradley. Eisenhower was stuck in the middle, unable to make decisive moves because every decision had to satisfy political masters on both sides of the Atlantic. That's why the Allied advance had stalled. It wasn't German resistance. It was Allied dysfunction. Eisenhower had the forces to end the war, but he couldn't use them effectively because he was commanding by committee until December 16th. December 16th, 8 p.m. Eisenhower received updated casualty reports. The numbers were catastrophic. The 106th Infantry Division had been shattered. 2 entire regiments were surrounded. The 99th Infantry Division was barely holding its positions. The 28th Infantry Division had been split in 2. Gaps were opening in the American line. German armor was pouring through. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, was advocating for immediate action. We need to pull divisions from other sectors right now. We need to establish a new defensive line. We need to stop the bleeding. Eisenhower shook his head. Not yet. Beadle, not yet. Smith was incredulous. General, if we wait, the Germans could reach the Meuse River. They could split our armies. This could be a complete disaster. Eisenhower walked to the map on his wall. He studied it for a long moment, then turned to Smith. How long until we understand the full scope of their attack? Smith consulted with the intelligence staff. 24 to 48 hours. We need to see where their main effort is focused, where they're concentrating their armor. Eisenhower nodded. Then we wait 48 hours. I want a complete picture before we respond. Smith started to protest, but Eisenhower cut him off. Listen to me, Beadle. If we react too quickly, we'll respond to the wrong threat. We'll pull forces from the wrong sectors. We'll play into their hands. But if we wait, if we let them commit fully, we'll see exactly what they're trying to do, and then we can respond decisively. There was something else Eisenhower didn't say out loud, something he couldn't say even to his chief of staff. If this crisis was big enough, if the threat was existential enough, he could finally get what he needed, complete operational control. If you're getting value from this deep dive into Eisenhower strategy, make sure you're subscribed. We bring you these untold stories every week, the moments that change history, explain the way they should be. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. December 17th, 1944. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to Bastogne to hold that critical road junction. German forces were surrounding them. The 6th Panzer Army was driving west. The 5th Panzer Army was pushing toward the Meuse River. American units were retreating in disorder. At Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters, there was panic. Bradley wanted to immediately commit reserves. He wanted to pull Patton's 3rd Army from offensive operations. He wanted authorization to retreat and establish a new defensive line. He called Eisenhower demanding permission to act. Eisenhower told him to wait. We're still assessing the situation. Omar, give it another day. Bradley was furious. Another day? Our men are dying. Eisenhower was calm. Our men are always dying. Omar, that's war. But if we respond incorrectly, more men will die. I need to see their full hand before we play ours. Bradley hung up, convinced Eisenhower had frozen. He told his staff that SAF had lost control of the situation. In London, Montgomery was reading the same reports. He saw opportunity. The American sector was collapsing. American generals were panicking. This was his moment. He called Eisenhower's chief of staff with a proposal. The situation in the Ardennes proved that Bradley couldn't handle command of such a large force. Montgomery should take command of all forces north of the German penetration. It was a logical military necessity, but Del Smith took the message to Eisenhower. Montgomery's asking for operational command again. Eisenhower read the message carefully. Then he put aside. Not yet. Smith was confused. You're going to refuse? Eisenhower shook his head. I'm going to wait. Smith didn't understand. Montgomery was asking for command. That would solve the command structure problem. Why not just give it to him? Because Eisenhower needed something bigger than giving Montgomery a victory. He needed a crisis so severe that everyone, including Churchill and Roosevelt, would support whatever command structure Eisenhower demanded, and that required waiting. December 18, 1944. The crisis was now undeniable. German forces had advanced 20 miles into Allied lines. The Bulge, as it was being called, was growing. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. American casualties were mounting by the hour. At ADF headquarters, the staff was bordering on panic. The Germans were winning. The whole Allied position in Europe could collapse. Eisenhower called a meeting of his senior commanders. Montgomery flew down from the north. Bradley drove in from Luxembourg. Patton came up from Nancy. The other Army commanders arrived throughout the day. The meeting was scheduled for December 19th in Verdun. But before that meeting, Eisenhower had one more thing to do. He had to let the political leaders see just how bad things were. He called Washington. He briefed General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, on the full scope of the disaster. Marshall was shaken. The largest American defeat since Pearl Harbor was unfolding in Europe. Marshall asked Eisenhower what he needed. Eisenhower's answer was carefully prepared. I need unified command, George. I need to restructure the command system. I need to put American forces north of the German penetration under Montgomery's operational control. There was silence on the line. Marshall knew what this meant. Bradley would be effectively demoted. American forces would be under British command. The political backlash would be enormous. Marshall asked a critical question. Is there another way? Eisenhower's response was firm. Not if we want to win this battle. The current command structure can't respond fast enough. We need unity of command, and we need it now. Marshall said he would talk to Roosevelt. Eisenhower made a similar call to Churchill through British channels. Montgomery needed to command all forces north of the Bulge. Churchill was delighted. This was what he'd been pushing for. He immediately agreed. By the evening of December 18th, Eisenhower had his authorization. In a crisis, with American forces reeling, with German armies threatening to split the Allied front in two, the political leaders gave Eisenhower what he needed for months: complete operational freedom to restructure his command. December 19th, 1944, Verdun. The meeting room was tense. Every senior Allied commander in the European theater was present. The maps on the walls showed the disaster unfolding. The Bulge was growing. American units were marked as destroyed, surrounded, or missing. It looked like a complete catastrophe. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words that surprised everyone present. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not a disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Some of the generals thought he'd lost his mind. Opportunity? American boys were dying by the thousands. How was this an opportunity? But Eisenhower had spent 48 hours thinking while everyone else panicked. He'd seen what the others missed. The Germans had committed everything. They were exposed. They could retreat without admitting total failure. And now, Eisenhower had the command structure to respond. He laid out his plan. Montgomery would take command of all Allied forces north of the German penetration. This included the American 1st and 9th Armies. Bradley would retain command of forces south of the penetration, including Patton's 3rd Army. This wasn't a demotion of Bradley. This was operational necessity. The German attack had split the Allied front. Communication between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and his northern armies was nearly impossible. Montgomery's headquarters was positioned to command the northern sector. Bradley's face went red. Eisenhower had just put American armies under British command. But Bradley couldn't protest. The crisis was too severe. The political authorization had already been granted. If Bradley refused now, he'd be the general who let his ego endanger Allied victory. He swallowed his pride and nodded. Montgomery was magnanimous in victory. He promised to coordinate closely with Bradley. He promised to respect American command traditions. He was getting what he'd wanted for months, and he was smart enough not to gloat. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George, how soon can you attack north to relieve Bastogne?" And that's when Patton gave his famous answer. "I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. The relief of Bastogne, Patton's rapid response, his pre-positioned plans, all of that has been told. But what's been forgotten is that Patton could only execute his plan because Eisenhower had restructured the command. If Eisenhower had reacted immediately on December 16th, the command structure would have remained the same. Bradley and Montgomery would still be fighting. Resources would be divided. Patton might have gotten orders to attack, but those orders would have been delayed by political infighting. By waiting 48 hours, Eisenhower had let the crisis develop to the point where he could demand and receive the command structure he needed. Patton's attack went forward without political interference. Montgomery's northern forces could coordinate properly. For the first time since Normandy, the Allied command structure functioned as a unified whole. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Eisenhower risked American lives to gain political advantage. Men died during those 48 hours. That's true. War is ugly and command decisions are brutal. But consider the alternative. If Eisenhower had reacted immediately with a dysfunctional command structure in place, the response would have been slower, more confused, less effective. More men would have died. The battle would have lasted longer. The Germans might have actually achieved their objectives. And don't forget to subscribe if you appreciate this level of analysis. We go beyond the surface level history. We show you the decisions that actually mattered, the calculations that leaders made, the brutal reality of command. Hit that button and join us. December 20th, 1944. The new command structure was in place. Montgomery was moving British reserves to block the northern advance. Patton was executing his relief of Bastogne. American forces were beginning to stabilize the line. The crisis wasn't over, but the Allied response was now coordinated, decisive, and unified. At NHAF headquarters, Eisenhower met privately with General Strong, his intelligence chief. Strong had been expecting to be relieved after missing the German offensive. Instead, Eisenhower thanked him. The intelligence failure, ironically, had given Eisenhower the crisis he needed. Strong was confused. "Sir, we failed. We didn't see this coming." Eisenhower shook his head. "Kenneth, we saw enough. We knew the Germans were weak. We knew they were desperate. We knew they had to do something. We didn't know exactly what or exactly when, but that's not the same as complete failure. And besides, Strong, if we'd known everything, if we predicted this perfectly, what would have happened? We would have reinforced the Ardennes. The Germans would have canceled the attack or shifted elsewhere, and we'd still be grinding through their defensive lines, still dealing with Montgomery and Bradley fighting over every decision, still stuck in the same political morass we've been in since August." Strong began to understand. The intelligence failure had been Eisenhower's opportunity. No, that's not quite right. Eisenhower had recognized the opportunity the intelligence failure created. During those 48 hours, when everyone thought he was paralyzed, he was actually positioning pieces. He was making phone calls. He was preparing the political ground. He was turning disaster into advantage. Military historians debate whether Eisenhower planned it this way. Did he deliberately allow the crisis to develop? Or did he simply react brilliantly to an unexpected situation? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Eisenhower couldn't have predicted the German offensive, but once it started, he recognized what it offered him: a chance to break free from the political constraints that had hampered Allied operations for months. The Battle of the Bulge would continue until late January 1945. The Germans would inflict over 89,000 American casualties, but they would fail to achieve any of their strategic objectives. They wouldn't reach the Meuse River. They wouldn't capture Antwerp. They wouldn't split the Allied armies. And in the process of trying, they would destroy their last mobile reserves. After the Bulge, the German army in the West was finished, not retreating and reforming. Finished, The spring 1945 Allied offensives would face minimal organized resistance. By May, the war in Europe was over. You could argue that Eisenhower's 48 hours of calculated patience shortened the war by months. But the real victory wasn't military. It was political. After the Bulge, nobody questioned Eisenhower's command authority again. Montgomery stopped agitating for supreme ground command. Bradley stopped threatening to resign. Churchill and Roosevelt gave Eisenhower free rein to run the war as he saw fit. The command structure that Eisenhower established during the crisis remained in place until victory. That's the story nobody tells about the Battle of the Bulge. Everyone focuses on Patton's dramatic relief of Bastogne, on the 101st Airborne's heroic defense, on the American soldiers fighting in brutal winter conditions. All of that matters. All of that is important. But none of it would have succeeded without Eisenhower's 48 hours of strategic patience. In war, the appearance of inaction can be the most decisive action. While everyone else was panicking, Eisenhower was calculating. While others saw disaster, he saw opportunity. While his subordinates demanded immediate response, he waited for the right moment. And when that moment came, when the crisis had developed to the point where he could demand and receive complete operational control, he acted decisively. The German commanders never understood this. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals, they asked about the planning for the Ardennes offensive. The Germans had expected the Allied response to be slow and confused. They had expected political infighting to delay decisive action. They were right about the initial 48 hours. What they didn't anticipate was that those 48 hours would give Eisenhower exactly what he needed to coordinate a devastating response. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the German Armed Forces Operations Staff, said in his interrogation that the Allied response to the offensive was unexpectedly rapid and well-coordinated. The Germans had studied Allied command structures. They knew about the Montgomery-Bradley rivalry. They knew about the political complications. They thought those complications would buy them time. Instead, the severity of the crisis had eliminated those complications entirely. That's a lesson of Eisenhower's 48 hours. Sometimes the best response to a crisis isn't immediate action. Sometimes it's watching, waiting, calculating. Not paralysis, not indecision. Strategic patience. Letting the situation develop until you can see the whole picture, until you can act with complete information and complete authority. Eisenhower understood something that many commanders never learn. Control isn't about giving orders faster than your opponent. It's about creating the conditions where your orders will be followed effectively. Those 48 hours gave him those conditions. The crisis had been severe enough that political leaders gave him authority they would never have granted in normal circumstances. The threat had been existential enough that subordinate commanders stopped fighting each other and started following his lead. By the time the Verdun conference ended on December 19th, Eisenhower had operational control that no Allied commander had possessed since D-Day. He would never lose it again. That's why he let the crisis develop. Not because he was indecisive, not because he was paralyzed, because he understood that those 48 hours would give him something more valuable than an immediate but disorganized response. They would give him the authority to win the war. If this video gave you a new perspective on leadership and decision-making in the most critical moments, subscribe to the channel. We bring you these deep analyses, these untold perspectives, the real story behind the history you thought you knew. Don't miss the next one. December 26, 1944. Lieutenant Charles Boggess broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Patton's Third Army had executed a maneuver that military historians still study today. But Patton's attack was only possible because Eisenhower had spent 48 hours creating the command structure that allowed it to happen. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive of the war. It was also the moment when Eisenhower finally gained complete control of the Allied war effort. He let the crisis develop, and in doing so, he made victory possible. That's the real story of why Eisenhower waited. Not weakness, not indecision. Strategic calculation at the highest level. The 48 hours that made control possible.